The terrible events of the Great Louth Flood. In the space of less than half an hour, on one Saturday afternoon, on the 29th of May, 1920, 23 people lost their lives and hundreds more lost their homes. The events of that fateful day were, until only a few years ago, still remembered by many of Louth's oldest residents. But this is now no longer the case, and the Louth Flood has passed into history, to be recorded only in history books and in walks such as this one. It is hard to imagine that such a small river could ever become a raging torrent, capable of doing great damage, of demolishing houses and sweeping men, women and children to their death. The river was not given its name, however, without good reason. Lud or Flood is an Old English name, meaning the loud one. Just to the west of Louth, 7 tributaries converge to join the Lud, so that the river's catchment area is larger than might be expected. And when there has been prolonged heavy rain on the wolds, the river can indeed become a loud one, even as in 2007, a dangerous one, capable of flooding any properties in its path. And if the river has not been maintained properly, if rubbish and debris has been allowed to accumulate and form a natural dam, as happened in 1920, just 3 miles upstream from Louth at Little Welton, then a wall of water can quickly build up where there is heavy rain, and when the dam gives way, cause considerable flooding and even endanger life. If we were standing here watching the river at about 4:30 p.m. on that Saturday afternoon on the 29th of May, we might notice that the Lud was a little higher than usual and flowing rather faster than usual, but there would be nothing to suggest the terrible events which were about to befall the town. It had been raining heavily in the town earlier that afternoon, particularly between 2 and 3 p.m, and we would see from the darkness of the sky that it was raining even more heavily a few miles to the west. But we would be unaware that the heavy rain was already beginning to cause much damage in some of the Wolds villages, that the train had swept so much soil onto the railway tracks that the train from Louth had been forced to stop at Whitcore, that at that very moment the school and a number of cottages at Welton-le-Wold were being flooded by 4 feet of water, and most ominous of all, that a lake of water up to 30 feet deep was beginning to form at Little Welton, where the river was blocked. Half an hour later, however, we would be running for our lives. At 5 o'clock, almost exactly, a wall of water 14 feet high hit the town, demolishing first the parapet on Westgate Bridge, almost drowning Mr. Osborne and his horses as he tried to cross the bridge in his horse-drawn bisonet, and then rushing along Westgate in a swathe of water 50 yards wide, sweeping anything in its path before it, including ornamental bridges, every type of garden furniture, a summer house, and the pigs and hens which lived in the backyard of the Wheatsheaf Inn, before crashing into the bridge here at Bridge Street and demolishing the parapet here as well. We will walk down to the bridge now and cross over the road opposite the old mill, now a private house, standing on the other side. Look for the stone flood marker on the corner of the mill house, showing the level which the water reached. In 1920, this former watermill had recently been converted to become a garage, and a number of cars were standing here when the flood water crashed into the building and swept the cars away downriver. Fortunately, no one was drowned here, and even the 12-year-old lad who was pedalling his bike over the bridge when the flood water struck managed to survive. Young Reg Larder would have one of the luckiest escapes. The force of the water simply carried him along Bridge Street and dumped him and his bicycle on the roads in front of St James's Church. And when he finally got home, bruised, battered, dirty, and wet through, his mother, who was still blissfully unaware of the flood, gave him a good telling off for getting his clothes so dirty and dishevelled. The flood water here rose to just 6 feet, and the level is still marked on a window at the back of Bridge Street House. So great was the force of water that it simply punched its way through windows and walls at the back of the houses on the west side of Bridge Street. A piano was swept through a hole in one wall and dumped in the yard behind number 15, and as the water crashed through number 11, then Tuxworth's Bakery, and now Beaumont's Delicatessen, it also took with it the right-hand bay window. Most of the inhabitants of Bridge Street escaped the floodwaters by rushing upstairs as the water poured in, but one man, a gardener called John Corby, did not make it to his stairs and instead tried to open his front door. But as he reached the door, the water slammed it closed and trapped his foot beneath it. Try as he might, he could not free himself. And all the time the water level was rising rapidly. Then, as it reached his chin, and he felt the end had come, the water stopped rising. The pressure on the door suddenly lessened, and he was able to prise it open and escape. However, his good fortune, it would later be discovered, was the consequence of another's tragedy. The water had stopped rising because only a minute or two earlier, further downstream, a number of houses on Ramsgate, which had been acting as a partial dam, had collapsed, allowing the water to flood through and the water level to fall. When we reach the traffic lights, we will turn left into Checkergate and follow the river and the course of the floodwater as it careered eastwards through the town. There were more houses on both sides of Checkergate in 1920 than there are today, and in 1920 there was also a yard called Ludgate, running back to the river on the left-hand side of the road, approximately where the telephone exchange building sits empty today. And in one of the little terraced houses on Ludgate, a mother was about to give birth to her first child. At 5 o'clock, Dr. Higgins, of nearby Bridge Street House, and the midwife were both in attendance upstairs, and Mrs. Annie Kerman was in the final pains of labour, when, with a terrible crashing sound, the floodwaters poured into the kitchen below. Mr. Charles Kerman, who was in the kitchen at that moment, rushed upstairs, but within minutes the water was following him, and before the baby was born, the floodwaters were beginning to cover the bedroom floor and creep up towards the mattress of the bed where Mrs. Kerman lay. Thinking that it might be their only hope of escape, Mr. Kerman climbed out of the window to try to fix up a ladder, but unfortunately he was not a good swimmer, and he was soon in difficulty. While the midwife attended to Mrs. Kerman, Dr. Higgins, who was a good swimmer, was obliged to climb out of the window to rescue him. The water was now 10 feet deep, but with the help of a washing line, the doctor managed to keep Charles afloat, and the two men were then able to climb onto the roof. By the time Dr. Higgins got back to his patient, however, the baby had been born and the water was beginning to recede. The family would all survive the trauma, but sadly the baby, a little girl who was christened Frances, was later found to be both deaf and dumb. However, she would overcome this impediment and make a successful career as a hairdresser. Also in Ludgate, Frank Fawn's garage was completely submerged, and many of the inhabitants of this little street, including the Kermans, would lose their homes. But at least no one in the court would lose their lives. However, round the corner in Checkergate, not every family would be so lucky. At the Halligan's house, at number 8, which had been barely touched by the flood, 7-year-old Edward had gone out to play near the river earlier in the afternoon. Before he could return, however, he was caught by the flood and swept to his death. Continuing on down Checkergate, past the lane which is now called mistakenly Ludgate, we soon come to the little cobbled path called Spout Yard. Turn in here and walk down the car park entrance on your right. In 1920 this was, like Ludgate, also an area of many small cottages, and a few still survive today. Within seconds of smashing into the houses on Bridge Street and then Ludgate, the river was flooding into Spout Yard, and although once again most of those living here managed to escape, not all were able to do so. 47-year-old Walter Bateson was having tea with his friend, 76-year-old Mary Bishop. Walter suffered from paralysis of the legs, and both were trapped when the water flooded into Walter's kitchen. A neighbour managed to swim to Walter's door and managed to get into the house, but as he tried to get Walter out, he was hit by a dead pig being swept along in the flood and lost his grip. By the time he got back to the house, both Walter and Mary had drowned. Towards the bottom of the Spout Yard lane, shortly before we reached the river, there is now a very pleasant small park on our left and a car park on our right. Close to where the park is now, there was in 1920 a very old tannery, which was completely destroyed by the raging floodwater, as was a garage and stable located nearby, where the Mason's Arms had once kept its customers' horses, and now kept wagonettes and motor cars. It is difficult to imagine, standing in this lovely spot, that 100 years ago this was a swirling maelstrom of watery chaos, death and devastation. Leaving the Spout Yard Park, we will continue our walk down to the river, but instead of crossing over the little bridge, we will follow the footpath on the right alongside the river. Just before we reach the road, you will see a large brick plaque built into the wall beside us, bearing the words Engine House. Until it was destroyed by the Louth Flood, the town's 4 fire engines, hoses and ladder cart were housed in the engine house here, right next to the river and looking onto Broadbank, which was then known as Engine Gate, after the engine house. But it was not only the town's fire engines and the building that was destroyed. 36-year-old duty fireman Harry Phillipson was also swept away and drowned as the huge swathe of water swept through the engine house and crashed into the houses, which we still see across the road. It was only fortunate that this was not a school day and school time, for next to the engine house stood the Girls and Infants National School. About 200 pupils were attending the school in 1920, with the infants on the ground floor and the older girls above. Nothing survives of the school today, but older residents may remember it as the town's fire station. After the flood, the school continued for another 10 years. But when it closed, the building was converted into a fire station. And this only closed in 1983, when it was demolished to create the car park. The houses standing on Broadbank today, facing the Broadbank car park, have changed little in appearance in the last 100 years. But just after 5 o'clock on that fateful afternoon, 100 years ago, this was a scene of terror, panic, and dreadful tragedy. At the first house, next to the bridge, and opposite the National School, Herbert Rawlings and his wife and 5 children were all downstairs when they heard a great roaring sound, and a wall of water burst through the front door. Even before they could reach the stairs, they were up to their waist in water, but all managed to reach the upper floor, where they would await rescue, while the water continued to climb the stairs and creep through the floorboards, threatening to destroy the house beneath them. Next door, the family could not make it to the stairs, but escaped by smashing a window and climbing up a drain pipe to the bedroom above. At number 7, now number 20, Mrs. Berry, the wife of the local butcher, was in the kitchen at the back of the house with 4 of her 5 children. Mary, who was 10, Jack, 5, Hubert, 4, and her 1-year-old baby, Edith. Mrs. Berry was also heavily pregnant, expecting her 6th child. Her eldest child, George, had been given permission to go to the cinema, and her husband was still at work. The terrible events that followed as the water crashed into the kitchen are described by David Robinson in his book, The Louth Flood. As the water rushed in the back door, she managed to get 3 of the children onto a dresser while she climbed on the table with the baby clinging around her neck. When the furniture began to float, Jack was terrified and fell into the water. As his mother tried to rescue him, Edith fell in, and Hubert also slipped off the dresser. Mary managed to catch hold of him and got him on the table, where Mrs. Berry fastened him by the sleeve of his jersey to a bacon hook in the ceiling. But the jersey gave way and he fell into the water again, which was now too deep to allow further rescue. Meanwhile, the gas lamp was extinguished by the rising water, and escaping gas almost stifled Mary and her mother, now clinging to the dresser. The 3 youngest children all drowned. Mrs. Berry and Mary managed to open a window to get fresh air and were later rescued. The first to reach them was a young man called Overton, who worked in Mr. Berry's shop. He could only reach the house by swimming through the nearby yard of cabinet maker George Cuthbert, and then climbing onto the roofs of adjoining houses. Beside the Berry house today, there is a short road running into the Co-op car park. Before we go down here, however, let's see if we can find the flood level marker stone on the corner of the Louth Museum, just a few yards to the right on Broadbank. The museum had been opened just 10 years earlier, but it largely escaped the flood, being a crucial few feet higher up the slope which runs up to Northgate. The water only rose to 18 inches above the floor level, and less than 2 inches of water and mud entered the building. The marker stone had not originally been set up here, however. It was moved here from the National School building when the latter was demolished in 1983. When it had been there, it had been set up high on the wall, for at its highest point, the water had reached a depth of 12 feet. In 1920, this little road into the Co-op car park did not exist. It was only made when the Co-op supermarket was built in the 1980s. We will walk across the car park towards the pedestrian exit on the far side, which takes us into the staff parking and delivery area. If we stop just before we reach this exit, we will be close to the site of the next tragic incident in this sad tale. In 1920, the area occupied today by the east end of the supermarket was partly taken by the Louth Steam Laundry Company. The building had previously been used by the Waterloo Dye Works, and in 1920, a row of 8 terraced houses, still known as Waterloo Terrace, ran north-south from the laundry, approximately to where we are standing. The laundry stood very close to the river, for, like the earlier dye works, a good supply of water was an essential resource. When the wall of the water hit the laundry, shortly after 5 o'clock, 2 young women, 15-year-old Maggie Winton and the slightly older Lizzie Caswell, were still working in the laundry office. As the water flooded in, they both climbed on to the long counter, but a moment later, the end wall of the laundry completely collapsed and the counter, with the terrified young women clinging to it, was hurled across the room, flinging them against the window on the south side of the laundry. Lizzie managed to hold onto a drain pipe, which was just outside the window, and she felt Maggie momentarily clutching at her skirt, but then Maggie was gone, swept away into the 10 feet of raging floodwater. Lizzie was shortly pulled out to safety, but Maggie had drowned. Her body was found the next morning in the laundry yard, lying in a pile of coke. As we go through the Co-op staff car park and come out onto Eve Street, we see Eve Street Bridge on our left. When the floodwater crashed into the laundry, a group of boys who had been sitting on the bridge, watching with interest the unusually full and fast-flowing river, ran for their lives in terror. All escaped, but any who ran up Charles Street would have seen an awesome indicator of the power of the floodwater. A large 3-ton lorry, which had been parked in Thompson's Yard on the north side of Charles Street, was picked up by the water as if it were a toy and flung 50 yards into Frank Darnill's brickyard, now the tennis courts, and dumped there, upside down. After crossing under Eve Street Bridge, the river turns a sharp left to run alongside this lower part of Charles Street. But the floodwater carried straight on across Eve Street and hurtled down James Street towards Ramsgate. So that is where we will go to. Such was the degree of damage inflicted on the James Street houses, particularly those on the north side, closer to the river, that as we walk down James Street today, we can see that on the left-hand side, the odd numbers side, very few predate 1920 houses survive, and most of the buildings we see are relatively new. Although the right-hand side still looks very much as it did in 1920, apart from the very new buildings close to the Eve Street corner, we can see that the left-hand side has been largely rebuilt. We know the depth of the water as it came rushing down the street like a great wave, because once again we have a flood level marker to show us. These were put on all public buildings affected by the flood, and we find the James Street one on the Technical Institute building, which is now a nursery school, on the right-hand side of the road, about halfway down. We will find that the water was about 7 to 8 feet deep at this point, just deep enough to drown anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in it. As the great wall of water crashed into James Street, so two ladies, Mrs. Margaret Bromfield and her daughter Clara, were cycling down the road, cycling back to their farm in South Somercotes after an afternoon together doing some shopping, happily unaware of the horror about to engulf them. As they reached this point just outside the Technical Institute, they first heard and then saw the great wave racing down on them. According to eyewitnesses, they attempted to escape the floodwater by climbing up on the large gateposts of the Institute, but the water swept them away. 2 more lives lost, but also others terribly and irreparably affected. Margaret had only recently been widowed. She had lost her husband Samuel to the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, and she was the mother of 4 children. Clara was her eldest. Her 4 orphan children had not only lost a mother and an older sister, they were soon to lose each other as well, for they would be later separated, one of the girls being taken to live with an aunt in Stockport, and the 2 boys being sent to live with distant relatives in Canada, and the youngest, 9-year-old Florence, taken in by a family in Mablethorpe. Clara and Margaret were also not the only ones to die in James Street that day. Across the road at number 71, 68-year-old Mrs. Elizabeth Smith was not able to reach her stairs in time and drowned. Others came very close to death. 2 doors down from Mrs. Smith, at number 75, Frederick Ingham and his daughter Phyllis also did not make it to the stairs. Instead, they climbed onto their piano, but as the water quickly rose, the piano began to float and tip them off, and they only survived because they were able to tear off the ceiling plaster and hang on to the beams. Further on down the road at 95, close to the junction with Ramsgate Road, Mrs. Betsy Kelly had a similar close escape. She was having her tea when the water burst in. Terrified, she climbed onto the table, but it soon became a raft, threatening to tip her off as well. But by managing to hang on to the window frame, she, like the Ingrams, was able to just keep her head above the water level until rescue came. And in a stable at the back of number 75, where the James Street surgery is now, a young horse also came very close to being drowned, managing to save himself by keeping his 4 legs on the stable crib. Approaching the end of James Street, close to the warehouse of the former carpet factory, where you can see the blue plaque, we find ourselves crossing the bridge which carries James Street over the river. It was at this point that the lesser surge of the floodwater, which had followed the course of the river, now met up with the main surge down James Street, and the 2 now joined to smash into the house standing on Ramsgate, looking down James Street, and also into a line of cottages on the right-hand side of James Street, which ran up to the corner with Ramsgate. If we stand by the bridge and look towards Ramsgate, we will see that to the right is a short row of early 19th century cottages, but immediately to the left of these, the row of houses is set back a little and dates from a more recent period. In 1920, before the Louth Flood, the row of early 19th century cottages had continued all the way down to the junction with Newbridge Hill, where Ramsgate turns right. When the floodwater smashed into these houses, it did not simply fill their ground floors with water, destroy carpets and furniture, and force the inhabitants to flee upstairs. 3 of the houses, numbers 32, 34, and 36, were utterly destroyed, and at numbers 42 and 44, great holes were punched through the front walls, and those houses to the left of these were also so badly damaged and weakened that it was later decided to take them all down. Not only had 2 courses of the flood wave come together to wreak such damage, On their way, they had swept through Hogarth's wood yard and picked up many large pieces of timber, including many tree trunks, 20 foot long. Most were deposited in Wellington Street, on our left as we walk towards Ramsgate, but some became battering rams, to be smashed by the awful force of the water into the Ramsgate houses. Here, where James Street meets Ramsgate, there would be more fatalities than anywhere else. Of the 23 victims of the Louth Flood, 8 would die very close to where we are now. At number 34, 17-year-old Ernest Frith was at home with his parents when the water crashed into his house. All 3 managed to get upstairs in time, but as the water continued to rise, they climbed out of a window and onto the roof at the back of the house. But even this could not save them, for where Ernest and his father were climbing on, the house collapsed beneath them, sending them tumbling into the wreckage below. In spite of his injuries and the force of the water, Ernest managed to reach a tree in the garden, and this saved his life. But William Frith, his father, was swept away. Next door, at number 36, William Fitch and his elderly parents were having tea when the water suddenly invaded their house. Unable to reach the stairs, Fred tried to open the door, but it was jammed by the pressure of the water. However, he managed to smash a window and succeeded in getting both of his parents out of the flooded house, and then carried them to where he hoped would be the safety of one of the garden trees. But such was the force of the water that, having smashed down the front wall of the house, causing it to collapse, it quickly uprooted the tree, and although William managed to swim to safety and climb onto a house roof, his parents both drowned. His father's remains would later be found nearby, but the body of Mrs. Hannah Fitch was not discovered until 3 weeks later. She had been swept down the river, and her body had been trapped under the arch of the railway bridge on Ramsgate. At number 32, however, the family had a miraculous escape. This was Robert Freeman's butcher's shop, and Mr. and Mrs. Freeman were both at home together with their son Cyril and a friend who had called, Miss Mary Hall. When the water came crashing in, Mrs. Freeman and Mary both fled upstairs, while the men bought a little extra time by holding the front and back doors open, letting the water flow through the house before joining them. To their horror, however, they then saw their next-door neighbour's house collapse. They then rushed to a rear extension, where, standing on a bed, they clung to the roof, terrified, while the rest of the house literally collapsed in front of them. Others were less fortunate. A few doors down, at number 44 Ramsgate, John and Susan Swingler, who were both in their 60s, and their daughter, 23-year-old Marguerite, were swept away and drowned when the water punched a hole through their front wall. And across the road at the corner of Ramsgate and James Street, both Mrs. Thorpe and her daughter Betsy also perished. Mrs. Thorpe was 77 and paralysed and could not be moved. A neighbour managed to reach the house, but the force of the water prevented him from reaching Mrs. Thorpe, and Betsy, who might have been saved, refused to leave her mother to die alone. We now walk down Ramsgate, past the newer houses which have replaced those destroyed in 1920, to the corner with Newbridge Hill, and then turn right to follow Ramsgate and the course of the Louth Flood down to the Riverhead. In 1920 this corner was a crossroads, for where we now see relatively new houses built in the 1980s, in 1920 there was another road running up to the railway station. Some of the eyewitness accounts of the horrors on that Saturday afternoon in Ramsgate come from those who were standing at the station waiting for their train. From the safety of the little hill on which the station stands, they had a very good view of the great tide of water, about 6 feet high, suddenly emerging from James Street and then dashing against the terraced houses on Ramsgate. When we reached the corner, we are standing on the northern edge of the flooded area, whose width now extended all the way across to Eastgate, a distance of about 300 yards, cutting the town in two. As we continue our walk along Ramsgate towards the Riverhead, we remain above the flood level, but all the lower lying land, which we can see through the trees on our right, including the large garden of the Priory Hotel, in 1920 a private house, was deep under water. A flock of 25 sheep were being kept here in 1920, but their owner had just enough time as the flood beat against the temporary dam of the Ramsgate houses to drive them waist deep to the safety of higher land. When the flood water later receded, from about 7 o'clock that evening, the sad mortal remains of Mrs. Bromfield would be found amongst the debris deposited there by the water. About 100 yards along Ramsgate from the corner, we reach what remains of the former railway embankment, which, until it was taken down in the 1980s, stood almost 20 feet high. The bridge which once carried the railway over Ramsgate has gone, but the bridge over the river, where Mrs. Fitch's body lay hidden for 3 weeks, can still be seen. The water poured through both this bridge and the one which carried the railway over Eastgate, 150 yards to the south, but not all the water could get through, and the embankment had the effect of pushing the water further south, so that the Edwardian terraced houses, which still lined the south side of Eastgate, were also flooded, and the flood water even reached as far as Monksdyke Road and the lower part of Priory Road. A little further on, and we come to the former flour mill building, now converted to flats, and here the road begins to dip as it approaches the Riverhead. Consequently, in 1920, from this point on, the water ceased to stop at Ramsgate Road, but instead poured over the road and flooded into the garden of a large house, which still stands on higher ground across the road, the Grove, and here it claimed another victim, its 20th, as the water shot across the road. Here it hit 66-year-old Charles Bowman, a carter. He tried to grab hold of a tree, but that too was swept away, and the water carried him into the garden of the Grove. He was still just alive when he was pulled out of the water by 2 men, P.C. Barrett and Mr. Hall, who had to rope themselves to one another to reach him, but he died the next day. Another victim nearby was 3-year-old Lily Metcalfe from Grimsby, who was staying with her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Harold Skinner, in Ramsgate. Her poor little body was later found in a greenhouse. Here at the junction of Victoria Road and Commercial Road, we are standing close to where this picture was taken as the water began to go down. One young man has had a lucky escape. Fit and strong enough to shin up a lamppost, he still hangs on, waiting for the water level to fall further. Just across the road where this picture was taken at number 17 Commercial Road, the Louth Flood took yet another victim. 61-year-old Mrs. Ellen Kirkham. Taken utterly by surprise, she was trapped in her kitchen. The watermark on her wall showed that the water was 6 feet deep here. At this corner, we cross over to the Riverhead Road and complete our walk at the Riverhead, beside the old warehouses and the 18th century canal pub, the Woolpack, which we can see about 100 yards in front of us. The old pub and the 2 warehouses both dating from the earliest years of the canal, are almost the only buildings on this part of the road which were here in 1920. It is a corner of Louth which has changed its appearance many times in the last 100 years. Among the buildings, which are long gone, is the house that was then number 1 Riverhead Road, which stood close to the corner with Victoria Road. This was the home of Charles Mitchinson, who would be the flood's last victim and its oldest one. Although he still worked at the canal for T.E. Smith and Son, he was 82 years old and lived alone. Like his neighbour Mrs. Kirkham, he was caught by the sheer speed and force of the water. When the water flooded into his house, he was trapped and unable to escape. His body was later found under an upturned sofa. We will finish our walk at the head of the canal, where Riverhead Road bears right and runs up to Eastgate and Eastfield Road. When the flood water hurtled into the canal and struck the surrounding warehouses and cottages, it would do a great deal of damage. The wreckage which it brought on the first lock, the town lock, was sufficient to cause the owners of the canal to decide that the end had finally come. Its closure had long seemed imminent, and as much of his business had been taken away by the railway. But it was the damage to the canal caused by the Louth Flood that prompted the decision to close. The canal was no longer as busy as it once had been, but it was still an active inland port, with horse-drawn sloops and keels still making the journey from the Humber. They were loaded principally with coal, chiefly for the Louth Gaslight Company, which still had its gasworks on Thames Street, on the south side of the canal, close to the town lock. A small community had grown up here, and many of the cottages of those who lived and worked here in 1920 can still be seen, as can many of the warehouses, particularly those on the south side. Almost all the cottages standing behind the principal wharf on the north side of the canal were flooded, as was the chemical manure works of T.E. Smith and Sons, Charles Mitchinson's employers. But the gasworks, standing on slightly higher ground, escaped. When the rain stopped at about 5:30 and the water level began to fall about an hour later, the Riverhead was a scene of devastation. And indeed, so was the rest of the flooded area of the town. Altogether, in the space of less than half an hour, 23 people had been killed, 50 houses had been destroyed, another 250 needed extensive repairs, a further 500 were badly damaged by floodwater, and 800 people had been made homeless. The number of deaths may have been higher still had it not been for the many acts of heroism and bravery. The misery for many, however, had only just begun. Those who had lost their homes were at first housed in tents on High Home Road, and when winter came, the tents were replaced by 60 wooden huts, and some families were still being obliged to live in these 7 years later, including Charles and Annie Kerman and their little girl Frances.